The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like a blanket woven from unspoken accusations and the stale scent of old paper. It clung to my skin, cold and unwelcome. My hands were clenched in my lap, knuckles white, my nails digging into my palms, a small, private pain anchoring me to the moment. Across the polished table sat him, my husband, soon, hopefully my ex-husband, his face a mask of practiced calm, eyes sharp, assessing, utterly devoid of the warmth I once knew. Beside him, his lawyer, a predator in an expensive suit, radiating smug confidence. My own lawyer, and was a quiet force of nature, her presence calm but electric, a storm gathering behind serene eyes. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, humming with the potential for explosion. This was it. The end. Or maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape. Every breath was a conscious effort, shallow, tasting of dust and apprehension. The room was sterile, impersonal, designed, I imagined, to strip away emotion, to reduce lives to numbers on a spreadsheet. But emotion was all I had left. Emotion and the cold, hard knot of resolve that had been growing in my gut for months. His gaze flickered over me, a dismissive sweep, as if I were already a ghost, irrelevant. A ghost he had tried to create. But ghosts, I was learning, could be louder, more persistent, more terrifying than the living. The polished surface of the table reflected the fluorescent lights above, a distorted mirror showing fractured pieces of a scene. I saw my own pale face, the tension etched around my eyes. I saw his confident smirk, a cruel curve that promised more pain, more control. This wasn't just about dividing assets anymore. This was war. A quiet, brutal war fought with documents and clauses, but with real lives, real futures hanging in the balance. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat absolute. The moment felt monumental, weighted with the history of our shared life, the bitter dissolution of our vows, and the desperate gamble I had taken. It was all coming down to this room, this moment, this heavy, waiting silence. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before the heavy air of that room, before the clenched fists and the taste of fear, there was a life. A life that felt, for a long time, ordinary. Comfortably, blessedly ordinary. We had met in college, the kind of accidental collision that feels fated in hindsight. He was charming, ambitious, full of big plans and even bigger smiles. I was quieter, more grounded, an art history major who loved old books and the smell of charcoal. We fit together in that easy, comfortable way young people sometimes do, building a shared world out of late-night talks, cheap pizza, and dreams whispered into the darkness. We got married young, convinced we knew everything, convinced our love was a shield against whatever the world could throw at us. We bought a small house with a patchy lawn and a leaky faucet, and we painted the walls together, arguing over colors, laughing when we got paint in our hair. We built careers, his in finance, a world of numbers and deals that seemed alien and slightly intimidating to me. Mine in museum administration, surrounded by quiet beauty and the dust of centuries. Our life was a tapestry woven with routine, morning coffee together, his rushed goodbye kiss, my quieter departure, evenings spent curled on the sofa reading or watching movies, shared meals where we talked about our days, our hopes, our small frustrations. We planned hypothetical vacations, debated having children someday, saved for renovations we might make to the little house. It wasn't dramatic or exciting, but it was ours. It was safe. It was the solid ground I believed was beneath my feet. I wanted stability, a quiet partnership, someone to build a future with, piece by careful piece. He seemed to want the same, though his ambitions always hummed beneath the surface, a restless energy I mistook for drive. He was good with money, meticulous about investments, always planning ahead. I admired that, saw it as a strength, a foundation for the security we were building. Our arguments were small, forgettable things, who left the lights on, whose turn it was to do the dishes. The big things, the fundamental things, felt aligned. We were a unit, a team, moving through life together, our paths running parallel, close enough to touch. I trusted him completely. His word was my truth. His vision for our future was my vision. The house, the careers, the shared silences, the comfortable predictability. It all felt like the promise kept, the life we said we would build. I felt safe, content, settled. I believed in the life we had created, in the man I had married, in the future that stretched ahead, predictable and calm. That belief was the bedrock of my world. It was my most precious possession. The first crack in the foundation wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, insidious hairline fracture I barely noticed at first. It was the conversations that didn't happen, the questions I didn't ask, the small details that didn't quite add up but were easily dismissed. Work trips became more frequent, calls less regular. His explanations for things felt a little too smooth, a little too perfect. Then came the decision. It wasn't one event, but 1,000 small, sharp pieces cutting away at the life we had. The arguments became colder, the silences heavier. The man I loved seemed to be receding, replaced by a stranger with familiar eyes. There was a growing distance, a chasm opening between us that no amount of shared history seemed able to bridge. The breaking point, when it finally came, was less a dramatic fight and more a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. A realization that the person across the table from me wasn't my partner anymore, wasn't even someone I truly knew. It was the accumulation of missed connections, of feeling unseen, unheard, irrelevant in my own marriage. It was the slow, painful death of intimacy, replaced by a polite, strained cohabitation. I remember the day I finally said the words. We were sitting in the living room, the one we'd painted together years ago, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. The silence was deafening. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw nothing familiar in his eyes. The love was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. My voice was barely a whisper when I finally spoke, the words feeling alien on my tongue. I think we need to get a divorce. The silence that followed was absolute. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. His face, which had been impassive, shifted, not into sadness or regret, but into something I hadn't anticipated. A flicker of something cold, something sharp, like the edge of a knife. He leaned back in the sofa, a slow, deliberate movement, and a smile spread across his face. Not a genuine smile, but a performance. A cruel, knowing curve of the lips. He looked at me, his eyes glinting. Divorce? He repeated, the word dripping with contempt. You think you can just walk away? He laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. You think you understand how this works, don't you? You think you know what you're doing? He leaned forward then, his voice dropping, becoming low and menacing. You think you can just leave and take half? Or any of it? His smile widened, becoming a predatory grin. You'll regret this divorce, he said, his voice soft, but filled with a chilling certainty. You'll regret this more than anything you've ever done. I promise you, he wasn't pleading, wasn't arguing, wasn't trying to save the marriage. He was making a threat, a promise of destruction. And in that moment, the comfortable, predictable world I thought I knew dissolved completely. The bedrock wasn't bedrock at all. It was quicksand. And I was already sinking. The air in the room, moments before thick with silence, now felt charged, crackling with a malevolent energy emanating from him. His eyes held a look I had never seen before, something calculating and utterly ruthless. It wasn't the eyes of the boy I fell in love with, or the man I married. It was the gaze of a predator who had just been challenged, and he saw me not as a wife, but as prey. The shock of his reaction hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't the sadness of separation I had braced myself for, or even the difficult conversations about property and money. It was the venom in his voice, the absolute conviction that he could, and would, make me suffer. He didn't raise his voice, that was the chilling part. His tone was almost conversational, a polite delivery of a devastating promise. You think you have options, he continued, his voice still low. But you don't. Not really. You have what I decide you have. And if you make this difficult, well, let's just say you'll regret it. Profoundly, he let the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. He stood up then, smoothly, effortlessly, as if we had just been discussing the weather. He walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, stunned, the echo of his words vibrating in the sudden, empty quiet. You'll regret this divorce. The phrase burrowed into my mind, a toxic seed planted in the fertile ground of my fear. My hands were shaking. My carefully constructed composure crumbled, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. The little house suddenly felt huge, hollow, filled with ghosts of a life that had never truly existed, or perhaps had only existed in my hopeful imagination. The man I had shared my life with for years, the man I had trusted implicitly, had just revealed a terrifying stranger lurking beneath the familiar surface. His threat wasn't just emotional. The look in his eyes, the confidence in his voice, suggested something more concrete, something deliberate and planned. He knew something I didn't. He had a strategy, a plan to make good on his promise. And I was walking into a battle I hadn't prepared for, armed with nothing but naive hope against a ruthlessness I had never imagined he possessed. The comfortable life was over. The war had begun, and I was entirely alone, facing an enemy who knew all my weaknesses, all my dreams, and had just sworn to turn them into ashes. The silence in the room felt different now. Not just empty, but hostile, filled with the lingering presence of his menace. The sunlight that had seemed so warm moments before now felt cold, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air, the imperfections in the walls we had painted, the chipped paint on the baseboards. Everything suddenly looked fragile, breakable. And I was the most fragile thing in the room. His words echoed in my ears, a chilling mantra. You'll regret this. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in my stomach, spreading through my limbs like ice water. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly terrified. The weight of his threat settled upon me, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a calculated declaration of intent. He was going to make my life hell. He was going to make sure I regretted leaving him. And the chilling part was, in that moment, looking at the cold, determined stranger he had become, I believed him. Utterly. The safe harbor of my marriage had just exploded, leaving me adrift in a stormy sea, with a predator circling just beneath the surface. My initial attempts to navigate this new, treacherous landscape were clumsy, fumbling, driven more by panic than strategy. I contacted a lawyer, a name given to me by a friend of a friend. She seemed kind, competent, explaining the process in calm, measured tones. But even her professional reassurance couldn't entirely dispel the icy grip of his threat. The first few weeks were a blur of paperwork, of gathering documents, of painful conversations about finances, about property, about the life we had built together being meticulously dissected. Every piece of paper felt heavy, weighted with the history it represented. Bank statements that showed years of shared spending, mortgage documents for the house we had made a home, lists of furniture and possessions that now felt like artifacts from a vanished civilization. It was emotionally draining, sifting through the remnants of a life, but it was also logistically overwhelming. Forms I didn't understand, deadlines I was terrified of missing, legal jargon that felt deliberately obtuse. And all the while, the threat hung over me, a dark cloud promising rain. He wasn't directly contacting me, not yet, but his presence was everywhere. The emails from his lawyer were sharp, aggressive, challenging every point, demanding endless lists of information, pushing back against every proposal from my side. It felt like he was using the legal process itself as a weapon, a way to prolong the agony, to drain my resources, both financial and emotional. I would spend hours poring over documents, trying to understand the intricate details of our shared finances, a world he had always managed, leaving me feeling naive and out of my depth. He had always handled the money, the investments, the bills. I had trusted him. Now, looking at the complex web of accounts and statements, I realized how little I truly knew, how much power he had held, and how easily he could manipulate it. There were numbers that didn't seem to add up, explanations that felt thin, investments I vaguely remembered discussing but whose details were a blur. Doubt began to creep in, a tiny, unsettling worm in my gut. But I dismissed it. This was just the stress of divorce, I told myself. The complexity of separating two lives. He wouldn't. He couldn't. He had threatened to make me regret it, but surely that just meant making the divorce difficult, dragging it out, fighting over things. Surely he wouldn't do anything truly underhanded. My lawyer was patient, guiding me through the steps, explaining the process, managing the barrage of demands from his side. She was calm, steady, a welcome ballast in the storm. But even she couldn't shield me entirely from the emotional toll. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being trapped in a legal machine that was designed, it seemed, to grind me down. I felt isolated. Friends offered support, but no one could truly understand the specific weight of his threat, the chilling certainty in his voice, the feeling of being hunted within my own life. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wary, jumpy. Every phone call felt like a potential blow. Every email a potential trap. The early struggles weren't just legal hurdles. They were psychological warfare. He was using fear as a weapon, and it was working. I was worn down, constantly on edge, feeling like I was fighting blind against an enemy who knew exactly where I was and where I was vulnerable. The comfortable house now felt like a cage, filled with memories that had turned sour and the lingering scent of betrayal. Leaving felt like a betrayal itself, of the life I had invested in, the future I had believed in. But staying had become impossible. I was caught between the past and an uncertain future, navigating a present filled with fear and the slow, grinding process of dismantling everything. And the chilling echo of his promise, "You'll regret this divorce," was a constant companion, a dark whisper in the back of my mind, amplifying every fear, every doubt, every moment of exhaustion. The struggle was far from over. It was only just beginning, and I was starting to feel like I might not survive it. The problems, initially manageable, began to intensify, multiplying like a bad weed infestation. His legal team wasn't just aggressive, they were relentless. Every request for documentation from our side was met with delays, incomplete information, or outright refusal, couched in technical legal language that required more time, more effort, more money to decipher and counter. It felt like a deliberate strategy to bleed me dry, financially and emotionally. My savings, modest but hard-earned, began to dwindle with lawyer fees. The legal bills arrived with terrifying regularity, each one a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the cost, it was the feeling of powerlessness. I was spending money just to access information about my own life, information he was deliberately withholding or distorting. He started using financial leverage outside of the legal process. Bills that were usually paid automatically were suddenly missed, leading to late fees and stressful calls. Joint accounts that I still had access to were drained of funds without warning. I felt like I was constantly playing catch-up, reacting to his moves, never able to get ahead. He wasn't supposed to do this, not according to the lawyers, but proving intent, proving malice, in the confusing world of financial separation was proving incredibly difficult. It was his word against mine, and his word, backed by expensive lawyers and a lifetime of managing our finances, seemed to carry more weight. The threats became bolder, though still not direct from him, always through his lawyer or implied through his actions. Hints dropped in emails about things I didn't want made public, veiled warnings about how much worse things could get if I didn't agree to his terms. It was psychological warfare, conducted through official channels. He knew my vulnerabilities, my aversion to conflict, my fear of financial insecurity, my deep-seated need for privacy. He was systematically exploiting them. I started having panic attacks. The knot in my stomach became a permanent resident. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios, replaying conversations, scrutinizing every document for hidden meanings. I felt increasingly isolated. Friends and family could offer sympathy, but they couldn't truly grasp the specific nature of the battle I was fighting. The legal process was cold, impersonal, stripping away the emotional reality of the situation and reducing it to numbers and statutes. And I was losing. I could feel it. His tactics were working. I was becoming desperate, exhausted, ready to give in just to make it stop. The thought of facing him in court, of having my life dissected and judged, was terrifying. His lawyer's letters became increasingly aggressive, demanding concessions that were clearly unfair, using our shared history against me, twisting past agreements, misrepresenting events, painting me as unreasonable, even unstable. It was a calculated demolition of my character, designed to erode my confidence and strengthen his position. I brought my concerns to and, showing her the discrepancies in the financial documents I was managing to piece together, the strange transactions I couldn't explain, the accounts that seemed to have vanished. She listened patiently, her expression serious. "It's possible," she said, her voice measured, "that he's not being entirely transparent. This is common in contentious divorces, common." The word felt like a cold comfort. It didn't make the fear any less real. It didn't make the struggle any easier. She suggested hiring a forensic accountant, a process that felt overwhelming and prohibitively expensive. More money I barely had, spent on the possibility that he was doing something wrong. The cost alone was a barrier, another way he was winning. I felt trapped. Every path seemed to lead to more expense, more stress, more uncertainty. The walls were closing in. The rising challenges weren't just obstacles to overcome. They were a systematic assault on my well-being, designed to break me. And I was starting to feel myself crack under the pressure. The carefully built facade of resilience was crumbling, revealing the raw fear and exhaustion beneath. He had promised I would regret it. And with every passing day, every new challenge, every mounting bill, I was starting to believe he might be right. The lowest point felt like falling into a well, cold and dark, with no hope of climbing out. Everything I tried seemed to fail. His lawyers blocked access to information at every turn. The forensic accountant was a slow, expensive process, digging through years of complex financial records, and the initial findings were inconclusive. There were irregularities, questions, but nothing concrete enough to prove deliberate fraud. Meanwhile, his demands escalated. He wanted the house sold immediately, regardless of market conditions, clearly aiming to force a quick, unfavorable sale. He challenged my right to certain assets, claiming they were separate property despite years of shared use and contribution. He even went after sentimental items, things that held no real monetary value but were deeply important to me, purely, it seemed, to inflict pain. My financial situation was dire. The legal fees were astronomical, far exceeding my initial estimates. I had taken out a small loan, borrowed money from a relative, but it wasn't enough. I was facing the prospect of having to agree to his unfair terms just to end the bleeding, to stop the relentless pressure. And my lawyer remained calm, but even her voice carried a hint of weariness. She explained the options, laid out the probabilities, and the picture she painted was bleak. If we couldn't find definitive proof of wrongdoing, the court would likely favor a standard division of assets, and with his careful manipulation of finances, that division would leave me with significantly less than I was entitled to, less than I needed to rebuild my life. I felt a profound sense of despair. All the fight seemed to drain out of me. What was the point? He was too powerful, too cunning, too well-prepared. He had spent years, I realized, not just building our life, but building a fortress around his assets, a complex web designed to withstand scrutiny. He had anticipated this, prepared for this day. His threats weren't empty boasts. They were promises he was meticulously fulfilling. The feeling of being utterly alone was overwhelming. Even and, with all her legal expertise, felt like she was fighting with one hand tied behind her back, hampered by his obstruction and the difficulty of proving intent. There were days I could barely get out of bed. The simplest tasks felt monumental. The house, once a symbol of hope, was now a suffocating reminder of everything I was losing, everything that had been built on a foundation of deceit. I started withdrawing from friends, too ashamed, too exhausted to explain the depth of the crisis, the extent of the failure my marriage had become. His words echoed constantly, "You'll regret this divorce." And in the darkness of those days, lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, I did. I regretted ever getting married. I regretted trusting him. I regretted believing in the life we had built. I regretted even asking for the divorce, because the cost of leaving was proving to be more than I could bear. All seemed lost. The hope I had clung to early on had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating sense of defeat. I was trapped, outmaneuvered, and on the verge of losing everything. The crisis wasn't just financial or legal, it was existential. It was a crisis of faith, in myself, in the possibility of justice, in the idea that honesty and decency could ever win against manipulation and greed. He was winning. He had promised to make me regret it, and he was succeeding. The well was deep, and I couldn't see the light anymore. I was on the brink of surrender, ready to sign whatever he demanded, just to escape the suffocating weight of the fight, to crawl out of the darkness, even if it meant emerging broken and defeated. The thought of giving in was a bitter pill, but the alternative, continuing this losing battle, sinking deeper into debt and despair, seemed even more unbearable. But then a lifeline. Or perhaps not a lifeline, but a match struck in the absolute dark. The forensic accountant, after months of painstaking work, found something. Not a smoking gun, not yet, but a trail. A series of complex transactions involving offshore accounts, shell corporations, and large sums of money that didn't seem to originate from or flow back into our shared marital assets. It was convoluted, deliberately obscured, but it pointed towards something significant, something hidden.
And called me.
Her voice, usually calm, had a new edge to it, a quiet intensity.
"We found something," she said.
"It's complex, very sophisticated. It's going to take more work to unravel, but it looks like he's been moving substantial amounts of money for a long time. And not just hiding it from you in the divorce, the implication hung in the air. Not just hiding marital assets. Hiding something else. Something bigger. Something that involved more than just his wife's money. The darkness I had been drowning in didn't immediately dissipate, but a pinpoint of light appeared far, far above. A flicker of hope, fragile but real. It was the possibility that his elaborate efforts to hide money weren't just about screwing me over in the divorce. They were about protecting himself from something else entirely. And that something else might be the key. It was a dangerous path. Investigating this would be even more expensive, more time-consuming, potentially stirring up something far more dangerous than a contentious divorce. But the alternative was surrender. Signing away my future, letting him win, letting him get away with everything he had done, everything he had threatened. I thought about his face when I told him I wanted a divorce, the cruel smile, the chilling certainty in his voice. "You'll regret this." I thought about the months of fear, the financial stress, the emotional toll, the feeling of being hunted, the despair I had felt, the moments I had genuinely wished I had never been born into a situation where this was possible. He wanted me to regret leaving. He wanted me broken, defeated, and wishing I had stayed in a dead marriage just to avoid his wrath. A cold calm settled over me. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it was transmuted into something else. Something sharper. Something harder. Determination. He had underestimated me. He had assumed I would crumble, that I would be too afraid, too naive, too financially vulnerable to fight back effectively. He had seen me as prey. But prey, when cornered, can bite. My turning point wasn't a sudden surge of courage, but a quiet, almost chilling decision. I wouldn't regret leaving him. I would regret not fighting. Not fighting with everything I had. Not using the very weapons he had tried to use against me. His greed, his deceit, his conviction that he was untouchable. I called and back. "Pursue it," I said, my voice steady, stronger than it had been in months. "Find out everything. Whatever it takes." She paused for a moment, as if surprised by the steel in my voice. "It could be messy," she warned. "It could take a long time. And it will be expensive, I understand," I said. And I did. I understood the risks. But I also understood something else, something fundamental that his threats had hammered into me. Sometimes, the only way out is through. And sometimes, the best defense is a devastating offense. He had pointed a weapon at me. His control, his ruthlessness, his hidden world of finance. It was time to turn that weapon back on him. The decision was made. The despair lifted, replaced by a cold, focused resolve. The fight wasn't over. It was just entering a new, far more dangerous phase. And I was no longer just trying to survive. I was trying to win. The day of the hearing felt surreal, charged with an almost unbearable tension. We were back in that sterile, impersonal room, the air thick with unspoken hostility. He was there, radiating his usual smug confidence, his lawyer sharp and ready beside him. My lawyer, and sat beside me, calm and centered, a quiet anchor in the storm. Months had passed since the decision to pursue the fraud investigation, months filled with more hidden documents, more complex trails, more expenses, and a grinding, exhausting wait for answers. The forensic accountant had continued her work, following the tangled threads, piecing together a picture that was far more disturbing than I had initially imagined. It wasn't just hidden marital assets. It was a pattern of sophisticated financial maneuvers, dating back years, involving large-scale tax evasion, money laundering, and potentially dealings with entities that were far outside the realm of legitimate business. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of intricate lies and hidden transactions. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, almost unbelievable. The realization hit me that the man I had married wasn't just a difficult husband trying to hoard money. He was a serious financial criminal, operating in a shadow world I had never suspected existed. The knowledge was both terrifying and empowering. It explained so much. His absolute control over finances, his reluctance to discuss details, his chilling confidence when he threatened me. He wasn't just threatening to make divorce difficult. He was threatening to expose me to his hidden world, to retaliate using the very tools he used for his criminal activities. But now, that hidden world was precisely what and the forensic accountant had meticulously exposed. We had the paper trail. Not just hints and suspicions, but detailed documentation, bank records, offshore account details, transaction logs, a damning narrative written in numbers. The hearing began with the usual procedural exchanges, the back and forth between lawyers over mundane details of the divorce. I sat there, my heart pounding, my hands clammy, trying to project an air of calm I didn't feel. He looked at me occasionally, a casual, dismissive glance, as if I were already defeated, merely going through the motions before signing on his dotted line. He had no idea what was coming, and waited for the appropriate moment. It was during a discussion about the division of assets, specifically his claimed lack of liquidity and the necessity of selling the house quickly. His lawyer was arguing forcefully, painting a picture of my financial demands as unreasonable, bordering on punitive, given my husband's alleged limited resources. This was it, and cleared her throat, her voice quiet but firm. "We have reason to believe," she said, addressing the judge, "that Mr. Husband's last name, S. claimed financial situation is not entirely accurate. In fact, we have uncovered evidence of significant financial activities that were not disclosed and which appear to involve, let's call them, offshore irregularities." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. His lawyer visibly stiffened. My husband, who had been leaning back in his chair with a bored expression, sat bolt upright, his eyes fixed on Anne. The air in the room, already tense, became electric. "Offshore irregularities," his lawyer repeated, his voice laced with contempt. "That's a serious accusation, counsel, and entirely irrelevant to the matter of this divorce. On the contrary, Your Honor," Anne said smoothly, her gaze unwavering. "It is highly relevant, as it pertains directly to the actual scope of the marital estate and Mr. Husband's last name, S. true financial resources." She then nodded towards her assistant, who placed several thick binders on the table in front of the judge and opposing counsel. They weren't the usual divorce documents. These were different, heavily tabbed, filled with spreadsheets, bank statements from foreign institutions, complex diagrams tracing money flows. These binders, and continued, her voice gaining strength, contain the preliminary findings of a forensic investigation into Mr. Husband's last name, S. financial activities over the past 10 years. The investigation, conducted by a certified forensic accountant, suggests a systematic pattern of concealing assets, not just from the marital estate, but from other authorities. She let the implications sink in. Tax evasion, money laundering, other, potentially more serious crimes. His lawyer snatched up one of the binders, flipping through it frantically, his face draining of color. He mumbled something under his breath, a strangled sound of disbelief. My husband's face. That was the moment. The mask of smug confidence shattered. His eyes went wide, truly wide, reflecting not just shock, but naked panic. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. He wasn't screaming yet, not with sound, but his eyes were screaming, his body language was screaming, every line of his face was screaming pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at the binders, then at me, his gaze locking onto mine. In that look, there was no longer contempt, no cruelty, just a dawning, horrifying realization. He had made a terrible mistake. He had threatened me, underestimated me, believed his hidden world was impenetrable. He had used his illicit financial activities as a source of power and a means of control, convinced that exposing them would be worse for me than for him. He thought the threat of revealing his secrets would keep me in line, or at least force me into a weak settlement. But he had miscalculated. He had forgotten that sometimes the person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous opponent. He had spent years carefully constructing his hidden financial empire, a fortress built on secrecy and deceit, believing it was his ultimate protection, his ultimate weapon. He had used it to feel powerful, to feel untouchable. And in his arrogance, he had never imagined that the quiet wife he had threatened to ruin would be the one to find the key, the one to shine a light into the darkest corners of his world. The climax wasn't just the presentation of evidence, it was the shattering of his reality. His carefully constructed world imploded in that sterile room, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of papers and the cold, steady voice of my lawyer. He had said I would regret this divorce. But as I sat there, watching the color drain from his face, watching the mask crumble, I felt no regret. Only a cold, quiet sense of vindication. He had screamed internally the moment he saw the binders. The outward scream came moments later, a raw, animal sound of rage and disbelief, when his lawyer, having scanned a few key pages, turned to him with a look of horror and whispered something I couldn't hear. The whispering stopped, and then the shouting started. Not at me, not at Anne, but at his own lawyer, then vaguely at the judge, incoherent accusations mixed with panicked denials. This is impossible. Where did you get this? This isn't real. This is fabricated. His voice was high-pitched, shrill, completely devoid of the smooth control he usually possessed. He lunged slightly towards the table, as if to snatch the binders, before being restrained by his lawyer. The room descended into chaos. The judge, initially maintaining composure, banged her gavel, demanding order. But his panic was infectious, swirling in the air like a poison gas. He turned on me, his eyes wild. You did this. How did you? He couldn't finish the sentence. The question hung unanswered, rhetorical.
He knew how.
I had simply refused to lie down. I had refused to regret leaving. The plot twist wasn't just that I found the fraud, it was the nature of the fraud and what it meant for him. It wasn't just a few $100,000 stashed away. It was millions laundered through a complex international network. It implicated not only him, but potentially others. This wasn't just hiding money from his wife. It was serious, federal-level financial crime. And the evidence we had wasn't just enough to get me a better divorce settlement. It was enough to trigger criminal investigations, to ruin his career, to potentially send him to prison. He hadn't just been playing games with my future. He had been risking his own freedom for years, building this elaborate criminal enterprise, and he had been caught. Caught by the person he had dismissed, the person he had threatened to ruin. He had been so focused on punishing me, on making me regret the divorce, that he hadn't seen the real threat. The real threat wasn't me trying to get half of our marital assets. The real threat was me uncovering the entire hidden structure of his life, a structure far more valuable and far more vulnerable than anything in our divorce agreement. He had pointed a gun at my head, loaded with his secrets, confident I would be too afraid to pull the trigger and expose us both. But I hadn't pulled the trigger. I had simply shown the gun to the authorities. And the gun was pointed firmly back at him. My victory wasn't just about money or assets in the divorce. It was about justice, about accountability, about turning the tables on a man who had used his power and his deceit to control and threaten me. He had wanted me to lose everything. Instead, by trying to protect his hidden empire from me, he had inadvertently led me right to the evidence that would dismantle his entire life. The divorce settlement became almost a secondary concern. With the fraud exposed, his position was untenable. He was facing potential criminal charges, ruin, prison. His priorities shifted from fighting me to damage control, to cooperating with the authorities, to trying to mitigate the devastating consequences of his exposure. He lost everything. His reputation, his career, his freedom, potentially. All because he couldn't let me walk away from a marriage he had already destroyed. He had threatened to make me regret the divorce. But the only one regretting anything in that room, the only one screaming, was him. And his regret, I suspected, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The aftermath of that day wasn't a sudden burst of triumph, but a slow, quiet unraveling. The courtroom chaos subsided, the judge adjourned the hearing, and the wheels of justice, both civil and potentially criminal, began to turn. For him, the consequences were swift and severe. The evidence presented was damning, undeniable. Federal authorities were notified, investigations were launched. His world, built on secrets and lies, collapsed. His assets were frozen, his business practices scrutinized, his reputation shredded. He faced not just the loss of his fortune, but the very real possibility of a long prison sentence. The man who had threatened to ruin me was now facing utter ruin himself. For me, the immediate feeling was not elation, but a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past few months drained away, leaving behind a vast emptiness. The battle was won, but the war had left scars. There was relief, yes, a deep, shuddering release of tension that had been my constant companion. The fear that had stalked me for months began to recede, step by hesitant step. But it was replaced by a complex mix of emotions, a cold satisfaction at his downfall, certainly, but also a strange sadness for the life that had been, or that I had believed had been. It was bittersweet. I had fought for justice, and I had won more than I could have imagined in terms of financial security, not just what I was owed from the divorce, but potentially restitution related to his other illegal activities. But the cost had been immense. The trauma of his betrayal, the stress of the fight, the dismantling of my fundamental trust in another person, those weren't things that could be fixed by a court order. The house was eventually sold, not under duress, but as part of the complex unwinding of his affairs. Leaving it was harder than I expected, like saying goodbye to a ghost of a future that would never arrive. I started to rebuild, slowly, tentatively, finding a new place to live, simple and quiet, free from the echoes of the past. Reconnecting with friends I had pulled away from, rediscovering the quiet joys that had been buried under layers of stress, walks in nature, losing myself in books, spending time on my art, which had been neglected for far too long. The lessons learned were sharp, etched into my soul. Trust, once freely given, would now be hard-earned. Financial independence wasn't just about security, it was about power, about having the ability to walk away, to fight back. And perhaps most importantly, I learned about my own resilience. I had been tested, pushed to the absolute limit, and I hadn't broken. I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. He had wanted me to regret the divorce, to regret leaving him. But as I looked back, I didn't regret the divorce at all. It was the hardest, most terrifying thing I had ever done, but it had led me out of a dangerous deception and towards a future that, while uncertain, was finally, truly my own. My life was quieter now, calmer. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably changed. The scars remained, faint but present, a reminder of the battle fought and won. But there was also a sense of peace, a fragile but growing hope.
I had survived.
I had rebuilt, and I was free. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.